When Daniel Hayes spent his last $3,000 on a rotting hut in the middle of nowhere, the entire town of Cedar Falls laughed behind his back. The local diner buzzed with whispers about the crazy hiker who threw away his life savings on worthless timber and overgrown weeds. They called him foolish, desperate, maybe even touched in the head. After all, who buys a falling-down shack with no electricity, no plumbing, and holes in the roof big enough for raccoons to walk through? But Daniel had walked these mountains for 20 years, and something about that old hut called to him in ways he couldn't explain. The previous owner had been eager to sell, almost too eager, and the property records showed gaps that didn't make sense. What secrets lay buried beneath those creaking floorboards that someone wanted forgotten? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel Hayes had never been a man who dreamed big. At 53, he had settled into a quiet rhythm that suited him well enough. Each morning, he unlocked the doors of Mountain Peak Outfitters, a small gear shop tucked between the hardware store and the old barber shop on Main Street. The familiar scent of canvas and leather greeted him like an old friend, mixing with the faint aroma of coffee from Martha's diner next door. His hands, weathered from decades of outdoor work, moved with practiced efficiency as he arranged displays of hiking boots and camping equipment. These same hands had once held Sarah's during their weekend adventures into the Cascade foothills. Now, 3 years after her passing, they mostly held solitude. The worn hiking boots beside his desk told their own story. 20 years of mountain trails had shaped their leather contours, molded them to feet that had walked every ridge and valley within 50 miles of Cedar Falls. Sarah had teased him about those boots, calling them his mountain wives because he spent more time with them than anyone else. She hadn't been entirely wrong. Tom Brennan, the shop owner, was a good man who understood grief without prying into it. He had given Daniel space to work through his loss, never questioning the extended lunch breaks that turned into afternoon hikes. At 68, Tom moved a bit slower these days, grateful to have someone reliable managing the day-to-day operations. "You're early again," Tom observed as he shuffled in at 8:30. His arthritic hands fumbling with his coffee cup. "Couldn't sleep," Daniel replied, which was only partly true. Sleep came hard most nights, but mornings in the shop brought a different kind of peace. The predictable routine, the steady stream of customers preparing for their own adventures, the quiet satisfaction of helping others find what they needed for the wilderness. The mountains had always called to him, even as a boy growing up in these foothills. His father had been a logger, his grandfather before him. Men who understood the language of wind through pine needles and the way morning mist clung to ridge lines. But Daniel had chosen a gentler relationship with the wild places, one that involved observation rather than extraction. Sarah had shared that reverence. She had been a teacher at the elementary school, patient and kind, with laugh lines that deepened whenever she spotted a deer on their weekend hikes. Her students adored her, and parents trusted her with their most precious treasures. Daniel had been the lucky one who got to come home to that warmth every evening. The memory hit him unexpectedly, as it often did. Sarah standing in their kitchen, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, packing sandwiches for another mountain adventure. "Where shall we explore today, my mountain man?" she would ask, her eyes bright with anticipation. The cancer had taken her quickly, too quickly for proper goodbyes or making peace with the unfairness of it all. In the 3 years since, Daniel had found solace in the very trails they had walked together. Each familiar turn reminded him of her laughter, each vista of her wonder at the world's simple beauty. The shop bell chimed, interrupting his reverie. Mrs. Henderson entered, looking for a gift for her grandson, who was joining the Boy Scouts. Daniel helped her select a sturdy daypack and compass, explaining their features with the patience that made him popular with the older customers. After she left, Daniel found himself staring at the property deed he kept in his desk drawer. The paper felt substantial between his fingers, official and somehow momentous. $3,000. His entire savings account, earned through careful years of modest living and careful spending, the previous owner, an elderly man named Garrett, had seemed almost desperate to sell. He had called the property a burden, mentioned something about family complications and wanting to be done with the whole business. When Daniel had asked about the gaps in the ownership records, Garrett had waved dismissively, claiming old paperwork got lost over the decades. But something in the man's eyes had suggested those gaps weren't accidental. Something had flickered there, a knowledge quickly buried beneath a facade of eager cooperation. Daniel had learned to read people during his years behind the counter, recognizing the subtle tells that revealed more than words ever could. The decision to buy had felt both impulsive and inevitable, like stepping off a familiar trail into unmarked territory. Every logical part of his mind had argued against it, but something deeper had whispered that this was important, necessary even. Perhaps it was the way Sarah had always encouraged him to take chances, to trust his instincts about the mountains he knew so well. The old pickup truck wheezed up the winding dirt road, its suspension groaning under the weight of basic supplies. Daniel had loaded carefully. A Coleman lantern, sleeping bag, canned goods, bottled water, and the essential tools for making the hut livable. The road hadn't seen maintenance in years, and branches scraped against the truck's sides like skeletal fingers trying to turn him back. When the hut finally came into view through the pine trees, Daniel felt his breath catch. In the golden light of late afternoon, it looked less like the foolish purchase everyone claimed and more like a forgotten piece of history waiting to be rediscovered. The structure leaned slightly to one side, weathered gray boards telling stories of decades spent facing mountain winters. But the bones were solid, the foundation stones still properly aligned. He parked beside a massive oak tree and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. The silence here was different from town silence, deeper, more complete. No traffic humming in the distance, no neighbors running lawnmowers or air conditioners. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a hawk circling high above the ridgeline. The hut's single room smelled of old wood and mouse droppings, but underneath lay something else. Something that reminded him of his grandfather's workshop, where hand tools hung in precise rows and every piece of lumber served a purpose. Previous occupants had built this place with care, even if time had worn away their intentions. As evening settled over the mountains, Daniel set up his sleeping bag on the wooden floor and lit the Coleman lantern. The warm glow pushed back the gathering darkness, transforming the abandoned space into something approaching home. He opened a can of soup and ate it cold, too tired to bother with the camp stove. This was when Sarah's absence hit hardest. She would have loved this place, would have seen possibilities where others saw only decay. Her mind had worked that way, always finding potential in forgotten things. Their own house had been a testament to that vision, filled with refinished furniture and rescued plants that bloomed under her patient care. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the small velvet box he always carried on overnight trips. Inside, Sarah's wedding ring caught the lamplight, the simple gold band still warm to his touch. She had been wearing it when the accident happened, the ring somehow surviving when everything else had been taken away. "What do you think, sweetheart?" he whispered to the empty room. "Did I finally lose my mind, or is there something here worth saving?" The wind picked up outside, rattling the loose boards and sending a draft through gaps in the walls. But instead of feeling exposed, Daniel felt strangely protected. The hut had weathered countless storms, had sheltered other souls seeking refuge from the world's complications. Now it was his turn to be part of that continuing story. He had brought architectural magazines from the shop's waiting area, publications that featured restored cabins and historical preservation projects. Under the lantern's glow, he studied techniques for reinforcing old timber and replacing damaged boards without losing authentic character. Each page turned revealed possibilities, ways to honor what had come before, while making it functional for modern use. The floorboards beneath his sleeping bag felt surprisingly solid despite their appearance. Someone had known what they were doing when they built this place. The joists seemed properly spaced, the foundation stones carefully chosen and positioned. Even the roof, despite obvious leaks, showed signs of thoughtful construction in its beam placement and peak alignment. As Daniel prepared for sleep, he noticed something odd about one section of flooring near the far wall. The boards there looked slightly different, their grain pattern not quite matching the rest. Probably a repair job from years past, he reasoned, though something about their placement nagged at him. He tucked Sarah's ring back into the velvet box and settled into his sleeping bag. The mountain silence wrapped around him like a blanket, broken only by the settling sounds of old wood adjusting to temperature changes. For the first time since her death, Daniel felt something approaching contentment. Tomorrow would bring the real work. Repairs to make the place weatherproof, improvements to make it livable. But tonight, surrounded by the honest scent of aged pine and the whisper of wind through gaps in the walls, he felt closer to understanding why this place had called to him. The lantern flickered lower as fuel ran low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Somewhere in those shadows, Daniel sensed history waiting to be uncovered, stories that had been silent too long. He drifted towards sleep with Sarah's memory keeping him. Company and the mountain standing guard outside his temporary sanctuary. The whispers started before Daniel even stepped through. The door of Martha's diner. He could feel eyes, tracking his movement as he walked down Main Street, conversations halting mid-sentence as neighbors took in his appearance. 3 days of working on the hut had left him looking rougher than usual. His clothes bearing the honest stains of manual labor, and his hands showing fresh calluses from hammer and saw. Martha herself stood behind the counter, her silver hair pulled back in its perpetual bun, lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. At 68, she had appointed herself the unofficial keeper of Cedar Falls' moral compass, and Daniel's recent purchase clearly violated her sense of proper financial stewardship. "Well, look who decided to rejoin civilization," she announced loudly enough for the entire diner to hear. "How's that palace in the woods treating you, Daniel?" The coffee shop erupted in poorly concealed chuckles. Bob Martinez, who ran the hardware store, shook his head with theatrical sympathy. "Could have bought a decent used car with that money," he muttered to his breakfast companion. "Maybe even taken a real vacation somewhere." Daniel ordered coffee and a muffin, ignoring the commentary swirling around him. But when he returned to his truck, a folded piece of paper was tucked under the windshield wiper. The message was brief and unsigned. "Smart men know when to cut their losses. Sell now before you lose even more." The handwriting was neat, precise, almost formal. Not the scrawled mockery he might have expected from local teenagers. This felt more deliberate, more calculated. Someone had taken time to craft this message, to consider its wording carefully. Rick Morrison appeared as Daniel was crumpling the note, his expensive suit looking out of place against the small-town backdrop. At 45, Morrison had built a successful real estate business by understanding exactly what people wanted to hear and when they were most vulnerable to hearing it. "Daniel, my friend," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of professional persuasion. "I heard about your recent acquisition. Interesting choice for a mountain retreat." There was something in Morrison's tone that set Daniel's teeth on edge, a familiarity that hadn't been earned, and a confidence that suggested inside information. The man's smile was wide, but somehow never reached his eyes, and his handshake lasted just a beat too long. "I've been in this business for 20 years, Morrison continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I've seen good investments and bad ones. That particular piece of property has been nothing but trouble for every owner. Drainage issues, access problems, questionable structural integrity. I'd hate to see you get in over your head." Daniel studied the man's face, noting the way Morrison's gaze seemed to search for signs of doubt or regret. "Appreciate your concern," Daniel replied evenly. but I'm comfortable with my decision." Morrison's smile flickered slightly. Of course. I'm just saying, if you ever change your mind, I have clients who might be interested. Cash buyers, quick closing. You could probably even make a small profit if we move fast enough." The offer felt premature, almost urgent. Daniel had owned the property for less than a week, had barely begun to assess its potential. Yet here was Morrison, appearing unsolicited, with talk of quick sales and cash buyers. Something about the timing didn't sit right. Back at Mountain Peak Outfitters, Tom Brennan looked up from inventory sheets with genuine concern. "Heard you've been getting some grief about your purchase," he said quietly. "Don't let them get to you. Some folks in this town have never taken a risk in their lives, so they can't understand why anyone else would." Tom's support meant more than Daniel had expected. The older man had built his business from nothing, had weathered economic downturns and changing markets through pure determination. His opinion carried weight that the diner gossips could never match. "Property's got good bones," Daniel said, repeating a phrase his father had used when evaluating old buildings. "Sometimes that's more important than appearance." "Your grandfather would have understood," Tom replied, nodding slowly. "He once told me that the best investments are the ones that scare everybody else away. Less competition, more potential for those willing to do the work." That evening, Daniel found a second note on his truck windshield. This one was different, handwritten in shaky script. "Don't let them discourage you. Some secrets are worth keeping." No signature, but the paper smelled faintly of lavender and old books, suggesting an elderly woman's touch. 2 messages in one day. Both anonymous, both suggesting knowledge beyond casual interest. Daniel tucked the second note into his wallet next to Sarah's ring and wondered what kind of secrets a falling-down hut in the woods might be hiding. The loose floorboard had been bothering Daniel for 3 days. Every time he walked across that section of the hut, it shifted slightly under his weight, creating a soft creaking sound that didn't match the solid feel of the rest of the floor. He had planned to address it eventually, but Saturday morning brought rain that made outdoor repairs impossible. Armed with a pry bar and hammer, Daniel knelt beside the problematic board. The wood looked original to the structure, weathered grey pine that matched its neighbors, but something about its placement seemed deliberately imprecise. While the other boards fit snugly together, this one had small gaps on either side, as if it had been removed and replaced multiple times. The first careful attempt with the pry bar revealed that the board wasn't nailed down like the others. Instead, it seemed to rest in place, held by gravity and the pressure of adjacent planks. Daniel worked slowly, respecting the age of the wood, and mindful that aggressive force might damage something irreplaceable. When the board finally lifted free, Daniel expected to find the usual cavity between floor joists, perhaps some evidence of old repairs or mouse nests. Instead, his flashlight beam revealed a deliberate modification to the substructure. Someone had carved out a precise rectangular space, lined it with oiled canvas, and created what appeared to be a hiding place. His heart hammered as he reached into the cavity. His fingers encountered something hard and cold, metallic. Drawing it out carefully, he found himself holding an ornate brass key, its surface green with age, but still bearing intricate engravings around the handle. The metal felt substantial, heavier than modern keys, and the craftsmanship suggested a time when such items were made to last generations. The key was unlike anything Daniel had seen in hardware stores or antique shops. The shaft was unusually long, with complex teeth that spoke of a sophisticated locking mechanism. Around the handle, someone had carved symbols that looked almost like a combination of letters and numbers. Though in a style that predated any typography Daniel recognized, under magnification from his reading glasses, the engravings became clearer but no less mysterious. What he had initially taken for decorative flourishes resolved into deliberate markings, possibly initials intertwined with dates. The craftsmanship was exceptional, the kind of attention to detail that suggested both wealth and the expectation that this key would be needed again someday. Daniel sat back on his heels, studying the cavity more carefully. The canvas lining was old, but intact, suggesting it had been protected from moisture over the years. The space was precisely sized, not a hasty modification, but a carefully planned feature. Someone had known exactly what they intended to hide here and had taken considerable care to ensure its preservation. The implication sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This wasn't a repair or renovation gone wrong. This was evidence of intention, of secrets deliberately preserved. The previous owner's eagerness to sell suddenly took on new significance, as did Rick Morrison's premature interest in a quick resale. Daniel examined the surrounding floorboards more carefully, noting subtle differences in nail patterns and wood grain that suggested other boards might have been disturbed over the years. The entire section showed signs of careful maintenance, as if someone had periodically checked to ensure the hiding place remained secure. The key felt warm in his palm, its metal conducting heat from his skin, and somehow seeming to pulse with hidden purpose. Whatever lock this had been made to open, it was important enough that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to preserve access to it. The question now was whether that lock still existed and what it might protect. Outside, the rain drummed steadily on the hut's roof, creating a rhythm that seemed to underscore the significance of his discovery. Daniel wrapped the key carefully in a clean cloth and placed it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. The weight of it there felt both exciting and ominous, a reminder that his simple retreat into the mountains had become something far more complex. He replaced the loose board carefully, noting how it settled back into position, as if nothing had been disturbed. To a casual observer, the floor would appear completely normal. Only someone who knew what to look for would notice the subtle signs that this particular board served a different purpose than its neighbors. As evening approached and the rain finally stopped, Daniel sat by his Coleman lantern, turning the key over in his hands. The brass caught the light, throwing dancing reflections on the walls that seemed to suggest hidden chambers and forgotten doors. Somewhere out there a lock waited for this key. The question was whether he had the courage to find it. Sunday morning brought crisp air and renewed determination. Daniel had spent half the night studying the brass key, and dawn found him back at the hut with additional tools borrowed from Tom's shop. If there was more to discover beneath the floorboards, he intended to find it methodically and safely. Working in careful sections, Daniel tested each board around the original loose one. 3 boards to the left, he found another that shifted slightly when pressed. This one required more effort to remove, its edges sealed with what appeared to be old wax. But eventually it yielded to patient work with the pry bar. The cavity beneath this board was larger, and Daniel's flashlight revealed something that made his breath catch. Carved directly into the stone foundation below was the top of what appeared to be stone steps leading downward into darkness. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each step precisely cut and fitted, disappearing into shadows that his flashlight couldn't penetrate. Daniel removed 2 more boards, revealing a rectangular opening roughly 3 feet by 4 feet. The stone steps continued down about 8 feet before leveling off into what appeared to be a horizontal passage. The walls were faced with the same carefully cut stone, and despite decades of abandonment, the construction remained remarkably sound. The air rising from the opening carried the scent of old stone and something else, something that reminded him of his grandfather's root cellar, but with an underlying complexity that suggested human habitation rather than simple storage. There was no mustiness or decay, as if the space below had been designed to remain dry and well ventilated. Daniel's flashlight beam revealed that the horizontal passage extended beyond its range, disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow the light. The ceiling was arched, built with the kind of expertise that spoke of professional stone masons. This wasn't a simple hiding place or storm shelter. This was architecture on a scale that required significant investment and planning. Before descending, Daniel returned to his truck and retrieved a longer rope additional flashlights, and his hiking gear. Sarah had always insisted on proper preparation for any wilderness adventure, and whatever lay below clearly qualified as uncharted territory. The descent felt like stepping backward through time. Each step down took him further from the familiar world of the hut above and deeper into something that predated his understanding of the property's history. The stone walls bore tool marks that spoke of hand craftsmanship, the kind of attention to detail that modern construction had largely abandoned. At the bottom of the steps, Daniel found himself in a rectangular chamber roughly 12 feet by 15 feet. The ceiling was a perfect barrel arch, and the walls were lined with fitted stone that wouldn't have looked out of place in a medieval castle. But this wasn't ancient construction. The mortar was too clean, the techniques too refined for anything earlier than the late 1800s. Against the far wall, a wooden table sat beneath what appeared to be a ventilation shaft that disappeared upward into darkness. The table's surface was covered with a canvas cloth that had protected whatever lay beneath from decades of neglect. When Daniel carefully lifted the cloth, he found a collection of papers, maps, and what appeared to be architectural drawings. The top document was a hand-drawn map showing the local area, but with features Daniel didn't recognize. Property boundaries were marked differently, and there were structures indicated that no longer existed. Most intriguingly, a network of dotted lines connected various points throughout the region, suggesting a system of tunnels or passages that extended far beyond this single chamber. The architectural drawings were more detailed, showing cross-sections of the chamber he now stood in, along with plans for what appeared to be additional rooms and connecting passages. The level of planning was staggering, suggesting an underground network that would have required enormous resources and secrecy to construct. One corner of the main map bore an inscription in faded ink, UJRM 1923, for the preservation of liberty and prosperity. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added, "What they prohibit, we provide." Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he studied the documents. These weren't the casual sketches of someone planning a simple retreat. This was evidence of a sophisticated operation, something that had required careful coordination and substantial funding. The dates placed it squarely in the Prohibition era, when such elaborate precautions might have been necessary for activities the government had declared illegal. The chamber's carefully planned ventilation, its hidden entrance, and its connection to a larger network suddenly made perfect sense. He wasn't just looking at a hideout. He was standing in what appeared to be a major hub of what must have been an extensive bootlegging operation. Monday morning found Daniel at the Cedar Falls County Courthouse, clutching a manila folder containing photocopies of the documents he'd discovered. The building's marble corridors echoed with the footsteps of bureaucrats and citizens conducting the mundane business of local government. But Daniel felt like he was carrying state secrets. The records clerk, a thin woman named Beverly, who had worked there for 30 years, looked skeptical when Daniel explained his research needs. "Property records from the 1920s aren't digitized," she warned. "You'll need to go through the physical files in the basement. Most people don't have the patience for that kind of detective work." The basement archive smelled of old paper and forgotten time. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers labeled with dates that reached back to the county's founding. Daniel located the section covering his property and began the methodical process of tracking ownership through the decades. The first surprise came immediately. According to the records, his property had once been part of a much larger estate owned by one James Robert Morrison, a railroad magnate who had acquired over 3,000 acres. Throughout the region in the early 1900s, the name sent a chill through Daniel as he remembered Rick Morrison's unexpected interest. In a quick sale, a 1922 letter from the Great Northern Railroad Company shed more light on the situation. The correspondence, written on official letterhead, discussed ongoing disputes regarding land acquisition, and the necessity of maintaining discreet access routes for legitimate business purposes. The language was formal and careful, but between the lines, Daniel sensed tension and possible legal challenges. James Morrison had apparently been involved in more than just railroad development. Another document, a contract dated 1923, referenced warehouse facilities and distribution agreements with companies that Daniel didn't recognize. The amounts of money mentioned were staggering for the time period, equivalent to millions in today's currency. The trail led Daniel to the Cedar Falls Public Library, where elderly librarian Eleanor Hartley presided over the local history section with the authority of someone who had witnessed much of it firsthand. At 79, she possessed the kind of institutional memory that no digital database could replicate. Morrison, she mused when Daniel mentioned the name. Now there's a family that left its mark on this region. James was my grandfather's contemporary, though they moved in very different circles. Eleanor's eyes sharpened with interest as Daniel described his discoveries. She disappeared into the restricted archives and returned with a leather-bound scrapbook that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. My grandfather kept detailed records, she explained, opening the book carefully. He was suspicious of James Morrison's sudden wealth, especially during Prohibition. Grandpa believed Morrison was involved in activities that went well beyond legitimate railroad business. The scrapbook contained newspaper clippings, personal notes, and photographs that painted a picture of a region in transition. James Morrison appeared in several social pages, always impeccably dressed and surrounded by influential people. But Eleanor's grandfather had made marginal notes that told a different story. Unexplained shipments arriving at night, Eleanor read from one note. Workers who spoke in whispers and disappeared before dawn. Heavy security around properties that supposedly contained only agricultural equipment. A photograph from 1924 showed a group of well-dressed men standing beside what appeared to be a railroad car. James Morrison was in the center, and Daniel recognized the landscape in the background as being near his property. The caption identified the event as a business planning meeting. But something about the men's expressions suggested activities that wouldn't bear close scrutiny. The federal agents came through several times, Eleanor continued, but they never found anything substantial enough to make charges stick. Morrison was too careful, too well connected. Whatever he was doing, he had covered his tracks with remarkable skill. Daniel studied a map Eleanor had pulled from another file. This one showing railroad lines and what appeared to be private roads connecting various properties throughout the region. The network was extensive, reaching into 3 counties and connecting to major transportation routes that could move goods quickly and discreetly. Your property was central to the whole operation, Eleanor observed, pointing to a spot on the map. If someone wanted to establish a distribution hub that could reach multiple markets while remaining hidden from federal authorities, that location would be ideal. As Daniel prepared to leave, Eleanor placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Be careful," she said quietly. "The Morrison family still has influence in this region, and not everyone appreciates having old secrets brought to light. Some stones are better left unturned." Walking back to his truck, Daniel felt the weight of Eleanor's warning. But he also felt the excitement of a puzzle beginning to reveal its secrets. The brass key in his pocket seemed to pulse with hidden purpose, waiting for him to find the lock it was meant to open. Tuesday evening found Daniel back in the underground chamber, this time equipped with better lighting and a systematic approach to exploration. The architectural drawings had revealed additional spaces beyond what he had initially discovered, and careful examination of the walls showed subtle variations in stonework that suggested hidden openings. Working from the map fragments, Daniel located what appeared to be a concealed doorway in the chamber's east wall. The stones there were fitted with such precision that the seams were nearly invisible, but pressing on specific points caused the section to pivot inward. revealing a passage that stretched into darkness. This new corridor was narrower than the main chamber, but equally well constructed. The walls showed evidence of regular use, with worn spots where countless hands had steadied themselves against the stone. Electric conduits ran along the ceiling, ancient wiring that spoke of a time when this underground network had been fully operational and regularly occupied. 20 feet into the passage, Daniel discovered the first of several side chambers. This one contained furniture that took his breath away. A mahogany desk sat against one wall, its surface still bearing the impressions of papers long since removed. Leather chairs surrounded a small conference table, and built-in shelving lined the walls from floor to ceiling, but it was the contents of those shelves that truly captured Daniel's attention. Bottles, hundreds of them, arranged with military precision and labeled with handwritten tags that identified their contents, proof levels, and dates of production. This wasn't just storage. This was a sophisticated operation with quality controls and inventory management that would have impressed modern businesses. Many of the bottles bore labels Daniel recognized from his grandfather's stories about the old days. Canadian whiskey, aged rum, and gin that had traveled sophisticated distribution networks to reach thirsty customers throughout the region. The quality was evident even in the empty bottles, their glass thick and substantial, their labels printed with the kind of attention to detail that suggested premium products. In the desk's bottom drawer, Daniel found a silver flask engraved with the initials JRM and a date, Christmas 1923. The flask was heavy, real silver rather than plate, and the engraving showed the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of wealth and refined taste. Inside, traces of what smelled like aged whiskey still clung to the metal. A leather-bound ledger in the same drawer revealed the true scope of the operation. Page after page of entries documented transactions that would have been worth millions in today's currency. The record-keeping was meticulous, tracking everything from supply costs to delivery schedules to customer payments. This hadn't been a casual operation run by amateurs. The entries revealed a network that stretched from Canada to major cities throughout the Midwest. Codenames identified regular customers, and delivery routes were planned with the precision of military logistics. James Morrison hadn't just been selling illegal alcohol. He had been running what amounted to a multinational corporation. One entry caught Daniel's particular attention. A special delivery to Chicago interests, premium reserve stock, payment in bearer bonds as agreed. The amount listed was staggering, equivalent to nearly $1 million in modern currency, and the notation, bonds secured in primary vault, suggested that payment had been converted to a form that could be stored long-term. Further exploration revealed 2 more chambers, each serving specialized purposes. One contained what appeared to be a primitive but effective bottling operation, with equipment for cleaning, filling, and sealing containers. The other served as living quarters, complete with beds, a kitchen area, and personal belongings that suggested workers had sometimes stayed underground for extended periods. The living quarters told stories of their own. Personal items scattered throughout spoke of men who had lived carefully controlled lives in service of the operation. Playing cards worn smooth by countless games, books that had been read multiple times, and photographs of families that these workers had been separated from during their underground assignments. In one of the bedside tables, Daniel found a collection of newspapers from 1929. The headlines chronicled the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression, but marginal notes suggested the underground operation had continued, even as the legitimate world above struggled with economic collapse. Most intriguingly, several of the newspaper articles had been circled in red ink, all dealing with federal raids on bootlegging operations in neighboring states. Someone had been tracking law enforcement activities with considerable attention, suggesting they understood the increasing dangers of their chosen profession. As Daniel prepared to leave the chamber that evening, He couldn't shake the feeling that he had only scratched the surface of what lay hidden beneath his property. The brass key in his pocket had yet to find its lock, and the references to a primary vault in the ledger suggested there were still secrets waiting to be discovered. Wednesday afternoon brought Daniel back to the library, where Eleanor Hartley was waiting with a manila envelope that looked like it contained considerable weight. Her grandfather's collection, she explained, included materials that the family had never shared with previous researchers. Items too sensitive for casual historians. After our conversation yesterday, I went through Grandpa's private papers, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the gravity of someone about to reveal long-held secrets. There are things about the Morrison operation that even the federal agents never discovered. The envelope contained a collection of photographs that took Daniel's breath away. Black and white images from the 1920s showed elegant parties in underground chambers that Daniel now recognized. Well-dressed men and women raised crystal glasses in elaborate toasts, their faces glowing with the excitement of shared secrets and forbidden pleasures. One photograph showed the main chamber Daniel had discovered, but furnished as an elegant speakeasy. Persian rugs covered the stone floors, and electric chandeliers provided warm lighting that transformed the utilitarian space into something approaching a gentleman's club. The same walls that now stood empty had once hosted gatherings of the region's most influential people. My grandfather was invited to one of these gatherings, Eleanor explained, pointing to a figure partially visible in the background of one photograph. He went out of curiosity and came away convinced that James Morrison was hosting more than just social events. These were business meetings where legitimate community leaders mingled with people whose activities wouldn't bear scrutiny. Another photograph showed a different view of the same chamber, revealing details that Daniel had missed during his explorations. Built-in cabinets lined one wall, their doors bearing intricate brass hardware that suggested both security and elegance. A bar area occupied one corner, complete with professional-grade equipment for mixing cocktails and serving premium spirits. The most revealing photograph showed James Morrison himself, standing beside what appeared to be a massive safe built directly into the stone wall. The safe was ornate, its door bearing decorative metalwork that suggested both security and substantial investment. Morrison's hand rested on the safe's handle with the casual confidence of someone who controlled considerable wealth. Grandpa believed that safe contained more than just cash, Eleanor continued. The amounts of money flowing through Morrison's operation were too large for simple storage. He suspected Morrison was converting profits into something more permanent, more easily concealed. Eleanor produced a handwritten note from her grandfather's papers, dated 1928. The careful script documented a conversation with a railroad worker who had witnessed unusual late-night activities around Morrison's properties. Heavy crates moved under cover of darkness, the note read. Not liquor shipments, something that required multiple men to carry and careful handling to protect. The final item in the envelope was a letter that had never been mailed, addressed to federal authorities but bearing no postmark. Eleanor's grandfather had apparently drafted it as evidence, but never found the courage to send it. The letter detailed specific dates, locations, and individuals involved in what he termed activities detrimental to federal law and community welfare. He was afraid, Eleanor admitted. Morrison had too much influence, too many connections to powerful people. Grandpa worried that making accusations without absolute proof would only result in retaliation against our family. Daniel studied the photographs more carefully, noting faces he was beginning to recognize from other historical documents. These weren't just social gatherings. They were meetings of people who wielded significant economic and political power throughout the region. Morrison hadn't just been running a bootlegging operation. He had been hosting a shadow government of individuals whose influence extended far beyond local boundaries. One photograph showed a group of men examining what appeared to be architectural plans spread across the main chamber's table. Daniel recognized the plans as similar to those he had discovered, but these showed a more extensive network than anything he had yet explored. The scope was staggering, suggesting underground connections that reached for miles in multiple directions. The operation continued even after Prohibition ended, Eleanor revealed. Grandpa's later notes suggest Morrison had developed business relationships that transcended alcohol sales. By the 1930s, he was involved in activities that made his bootlegging years look simple by comparison. As Daniel prepared to leave, Eleanor handed him a small brass key that looked remarkably similar to the one he had found beneath the floorboards. "Grandpa had this," she said quietly. "He never told anyone where he got it or what it was for, but I suspect you might know what to do with it." Walking back to his truck, Daniel felt the weight of 2 brass keys in his pocket. Whatever secrets lay hidden in Morrison's underground network, he now had Eleanor Hartley as an ally in uncovering them. The past was beginning to reveal its closely guarded mysteries. Thursday morning brought Daniel back to the underground chambers with both brass keys and a renewed sense of purpose. Eleanor's photographs had revealed details he had missed during his initial explorations, and the similarity between the 2 keys suggested they were part of a coordinated system rather than isolated artifacts. Using the architectural drawings as a guide, Daniel began a systematic search for the ornate safe that had appeared in the photographs. The main chamber's stone walls showed subtle variations in construction that suggested some sections had been modified after the initial building phase. Behind what appeared to be solid stone, Daniel discovered a section that sounded hollow when tapped. Careful examination revealed that an entire section of the east wall was actually a concealed panel, constructed with such skill that the seams were virtually invisible. Using techniques Eleanor's grandfather had described in his notes, Daniel located the hidden mechanism that caused the panel to swing inward, revealing the safe exactly as it had appeared in the 1920s photographs. The safe was magnificent, a work of art as much as a security device. Standing nearly 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, its door bore intricate metalwork that depicted scenes of mountain landscapes and railroad construction. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, suggesting Morrison had commissioned this piece from master artisans who understood both security and aesthetic beauty. But it was the lock mechanism that truly captured Daniel's attention. Rather than a single dial or keyhole, the safe featured 2 separate locking systems, each requiring its own key. The first lock was positioned conventionally in the door's center, while the second was hidden behind a small decorative panel that required careful manipulation to reveal. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he inserted the first brass key into the primary lock. The mechanism turned smoothly, despite decades of abandonment, suggesting the safe had been built to maintain its function even under adverse conditions. A satisfying click indicated the first security level had been disengaged. The second key fit the hidden lock perfectly, and Daniel felt the same smooth operation as complex internal mechanisms responded to the proper combination. When both keys had been turned, the massive door swung open with surprising ease, revealing an interior that took his breath away. The safe contained multiple compartments, each designed for specific types of storage. Steel drawers lined one side, while reinforced shelves occupied the other. But it was the contents that truly staggered Daniel. Bearer bonds filled several drawers, their certificates bearing denominations that represented enormous wealth, even by modern standards. A leather-bound ledger occupied the central shelf, its pages documenting financial transactions that dwarfed anything Daniel had found in the previous records. These weren't simply bootlegging profits. They represented diversified investments, real estate holdings, and business ventures that had transformed illegal alcohol sales into legitimate wealth across multiple industries. The ledger revealed that Morrison had been converting his prohibition profits into bearer bonds, gold certificates, and other instruments that could be easily transported and converted to cash when needed. The total value, calculated in margin notes, approached $4 million in 1929 currency, equivalent to tens of millions in today's purchasing power. One drawer contained correspondence with financial institutions in Chicago, New York, and even European banks. Morrison hadn't just been hiding money. He had been operating an international financial network that moved wealth across borders with remarkable sophistication. The letters discussed investment strategies and risk management techniques that wouldn't have seemed out of place in modern financial journals. Another compartment held what appeared to be insurance policies, each bearing Morrison's signature and substantial coverage amounts. But closer examination revealed these weren't standard insurance documents. They were agreements with other bootleggers, creating a mutual protection system that shared risks and profits across a network of operations throughout the Midwest. The most intriguing discovery was a collection of photographs showing tunnel entrances at various locations throughout the region. Each photograph was labeled with coordinates and coded references that corresponded to entries in the main ledger. The underground network Morrison had constructed was far more extensive than Daniel had imagined, connecting properties across 3 counties through a system of passages that had never appeared on any official maps. At the bottom of the safe, Daniel found a sealed envelope bearing his property's legal description and a note in Morrison's distinctive handwriting. "For whoever inherits this legacy, may you use it more wisely than those who came before." The envelope contained detailed maps of the entire tunnel system, along with locations of additional storage sites and emergency exits. As Daniel sat surrounded by evidence of Morrison's extraordinary operation, he began to understand why Rick Morrison had been so eager to acquire the property. This wasn't just land with historical significance. It was the key to recovering a family fortune that had been hidden for nearly a century. Friday brought an unwelcome discovery that changed everything. Daniel was returning from his morning coffee run when he noticed something that hadn't been there the day before. Attached to a pine tree roughly 50 yards from the hut was a small device that looked distinctly out of place in the wilderness setting. The device was modern, sleek, and obviously expensive. Solar panels on top powered what appeared to be a sophisticated surveillance camera, complete with wireless transmission capabilities. Someone had been watching his activities, documenting his discoveries, and probably reporting his progress to interested parties. Daniel's first instinct was to remove the device immediately, but years of hiking in wilderness areas had taught him patience and observation. Instead, he approached it carefully, noting its positioning and capabilities. The camera was aimed directly at the hut's entrance and appeared to have a clear view of anyone coming or going from the property. More disturbing was the realization that the device hadn't been placed recently. Examination of the mounting hardware showed weathering that suggested it had been in position for weeks, possibly since before he had purchased the property. Someone had known about the hut's significance long before Daniel had made his discovery. Returning to town, Daniel found Rick Morrison waiting in the parking lot of Mountain Peak Outfitters. The real estate developer's usually polished appearance showed signs of strain, and his smile seemed forced as he approached Daniel's truck. "I've been thinking about our conversation," Morrison said without preamble. "My clients are prepared to make a very generous offer for your property. Cash deal, no inspection requirements, closing within a week. You could walk away with a substantial profit." The urgency in Morrison's voice was impossible to miss. This wasn't casual interest in a real estate transaction. This was the desperate maneuvering of someone under pressure to acquire something specific before a deadline. "What's the rush?" Daniel asked, studying Morrison's face for tells. "No rush," Morrison replied too quickly. "Just good business sense. Property values in that area are likely to decline once the county begins its infrastructure assessment. Something about soil stability issues and access road maintenance costs. Daniel had heard no mention of county assessments or infrastructure problems. Morrison was improvising, creating pressure where none existed. The man's obvious desperation suggested he knew exactly what lay beneath the hut and was running out of time to claim it. "I'll think about it," Daniel said, watching Morrison's reaction. The developer's facade cracked slightly. "Look, Daniel, I'm trying to help you here. There are forces at work that you don't understand. Some situations are better resolved quickly and quietly without unnecessary complications." The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. Morrison wasn't just offering to buy property. He was warning Daniel that continued exploration might have consequences. That evening, Daniel called Eleanor from a payphone at the gas station, avoiding his home phone in case it was being monitored. Eleanor's voice carried immediate concern when he described the surveillance device and Morrison's escalating pressure. "My grandfather's notes mention something similar," she said quietly. "In 1929, just before the stock market crash, federal agents began surveillance of Morrison's activities. But they weren't the only ones watching. Grandpa believed Morrison's business partners were also keeping track of his movements, possibly planning to eliminate him if he became a liability." Eleanor's revelation added a new dimension to Daniel's situation. If the original Morrison had been under pressure from multiple directions, it explained why he had taken such elaborate precautions to hide his wealth. It also suggested that modern descendants might be equally ruthless in protecting family interests. "There's something else," Eleanor continued. "I found a letter Grandpa never showed anyone. It suggests Morrison didn't disappear voluntarily in 1930. The family story about him moving to California might have been created to cover up something more sinister." The implications sent a chill through Daniel. If James Morrison had been eliminated by business partners or federal agents, his hidden wealth would have remained exactly where he left it, waiting for someone with the knowledge and keys to retrieve it. Returning to his truck, Daniel found another note tucked under the windshield wiper. This one was typed rather than handwritten, and its message was direct. "Some secrets should remain buried. Your safety depends on understanding this simple truth." As Daniel drove home through the darkening mountain roads, he realized his simple retreat into the wilderness had become something far more dangerous. Powerful people with long memories and modern resources were watching his every move, and his discoveries had apparently threatened interests that reached back nearly a century. The brass keys in his pocket felt heavier than ever, weighted with the knowledge that they unlocked more than just hidden chambers. They had opened a conflict between past and present that he was only beginning to understand. Saturday morning brought a registered letter that Daniel almost didn't sign for. The return address belonged to a law firm in Seattle that he had never heard of, and the thick envelope suggested legal documents that could complicate his already precarious situation. The letter's contents were worse than he had anticipated. Baxter, Morrison and Associates claimed to represent interested parties who disputed Daniel's ownership of the property. According to their research, the original sale had been conducted without proper disclosure of environmental hazards, historical significance, and pre-existing claims that predated the current deed. The legal language was dense and intimidating, filled with references to statutes Daniel had never heard of and penalties that could result in criminal charges if he continued unauthorized. Excavation and removal of protected historical artifacts. They demanded immediate cessation of all activities on the property and suggested a meeting to discuss mutually beneficial resolution of this matter. What chilled Daniel most was the letter's specific knowledge of his discoveries. The lawyers mentioned underground structures of historical significance and artifacts that may be subject to federal protection under the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. Someone had been providing them with detailed reports of his activities. Daniel drove immediately to Eleanor's house, a modest Victorian cottage on the edge of town that reflected a lifetime of careful maintenance and scholarly interests. Eleanor answered the door in gardening clothes, her silver hair pulled back with dirt-stained gloves, but her expression sharpened immediately when she saw his face. "Legal troubles?" she asked, reading the tension in his posture. Eleanor's living room was lined with bookshelves that reached to the ceiling, filled with local history volumes and family papers that represented decades of careful research. She cleared space on her dining room table and spread out the legal documents alongside materials from her grandfather's collection. "Baxter, Morrison and Associates," she read aloud, her voice carrying recognition. "I remember that name from Grandpa's papers. They've been the Morrison family's legal representatives for 3 generations." Eleanor disappeared into her basement and returned with a file folder that contained correspondence dating back to the 1940s. The letterhead was identical to Daniel's threatening letter, though the partners' names had changed over the decades. After James Morrison disappeared, the family hired these lawyers to protect their interests, Eleanor explained. Grandpa believed they had been searching for the hidden wealth ever since, using legal pressure to investigate properties throughout the region. One document from 1952 showed the law firm challenging ownership of properties throughout 3 counties, always using environmental or historical preservation arguments to gain access for archaeological assessment. The pattern was consistent: legal pressure followed by careful investigation, followed by quiet withdrawal when nothing valuable was discovered. They've been systematically searching for nearly 70 years, Eleanor realized. Your purchase must have triggered some kind of alert in their monitoring system. Daniel studied a map Eleanor had created, plotting all the properties that had been challenged by the Morrison family lawyers over the decades. The pattern was revealing. They had investigated every piece of land that had once belonged to James Morrison's original estate, working outward from known locations in an expanding search pattern. "They're running out of places to look," Daniel observed. "My property might be one of their last hopes." Eleanor nodded gravely. "Which makes them dangerous. When people have invested decades of effort and enormous resources in a search, they don't give up easily when they finally get close to success." The most disturbing document was a private investigator's report from 1978, detailing surveillance of a previous property owner who had discovered anomalous structural features during renovation work. The report described intimidation tactics that had ultimately convinced the owner to sell quickly and relocate out of state. "They have a system," Eleanor said quietly. "Legal pressure, surveillance, and escalating intimidation until people decide the property isn't worth the trouble. It's worked for them dozens of times over the years." Daniel felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. These people had been using wealth and legal manipulation to bully honest citizens for decades, preventing others from enjoying property they had legitimately purchased. The thought of giving in to their tactics galled him. "There's something else you should know," Eleanor said, producing a final document from her grandfather's files. The original James Morrison made provisions for exactly this situation. Hidden in his papers was a will that specifically addresses the disposition of his concealed assets. The will, written in Morrison's own hand and properly witnessed, stated that any wealth he had hidden on his properties would belong to whoever legitimately purchased the land and had the knowledge and courage to claim it. It was a direct challenge to his own family, whom he apparently didn't trust to handle his legacy responsibly. Daniel realized he was holding more than just a property deed. He was holding ammunition for a legal battle that had been brewing for nearly a century. Sunday afternoon brought Daniel back to the underground chambers with a specific purpose. Eleanor's revelation about James Morrison's will had given him new direction, and careful re-examination of the safe's contents revealed details he had initially overlooked in his excitement over the bearer bonds and financial documents. Behind the main compartments, Daniel discovered a section of the safe that appeared to be solid steel but sounded hollow when tapped. Working carefully with a flashlight and magnifying glass, he located a hairline seam that suggested another concealed panel. The mechanism that opened it was ingenious, requiring simultaneous pressure on 3 specific points that would be impossible to find without detailed knowledge. When the panel finally opened, Daniel found himself looking at a steel safety deposit box, roughly 18 inches square and 6 inches deep. The box was secured with 2 more locks, but these weren't keyhole mechanisms. Instead, they appeared to be combination locks with letter wheels rather than numbers, suggesting passwords or phrases rather than numerical sequences. Examination of James Morrison's personal papers provided the clues Daniel needed. References to specific dates and places that had been important to Morrison appeared throughout his correspondence, and patient trial and error revealed that the combinations were biographical details. His mother's maiden name and the date of his first successful business venture. The safety deposit box contained the real treasure. Bearer bonds worth nearly $4 million in 1929 currency filled most of the space, their certificates pristine despite decades of storage. These weren't the working capital that Morrison had used for daily operations. These were his insurance policy, wealth converted to a form that could survive economic collapse or political upheaval. But it was the accompanying documentation that truly staggered Daniel. A detailed inventory listed additional caches throughout the underground network, each containing specific amounts of gold, currency, and valuable artifacts. Morrison had distributed his wealth across multiple locations, creating a treasure map that would take months to fully explore. Most importantly, the box contained Morrison's actual will, not the version that had been filed with the county after his disappearance. This document, written in Morrison's own hand and bearing multiple witness signatures, told a different story about his intentions and his assessment of his family's character. I have concluded that my blood relatives lack the wisdom and character necessary to manage the wealth I have accumulated, Morrison had written. Therefore, I direct that my concealed assets shall belong to whoever has the intelligence to discover them and the courage to claim them against inevitable opposition. The will went on to describe Morrison's disillusionment with his family's greed and their willingness to compromise principles for personal gain. He had apparently suspected that they would use any means necessary to claim his wealth, regardless of legal or ethical considerations. A separate document contained Morrison's assessment of the legal and political situation in 1929. He had anticipated federal prosecution, economic collapse, and family betrayal. His disappearance hadn't been voluntary departure to California. It had been carefully planned death simulation designed to protect both himself and his wealth from multiple threats. Daniel sat in the underground chamber, surrounded by evidence of Morrison's extraordinary foresight and planning. The man had essentially created a time capsule that would reward whoever was clever enough to solve his puzzles and brave enough to face the consequences of success. The implications were overwhelming. Daniel wasn't just inheriting hidden wealth. He was inheriting Morrison's challenge to his own descendants, a test of character that had been waiting nearly a century for someone to pass it. But Morrison had also included practical guidance for whoever found his treasure. Detailed instructions explained how to convert bearer bonds to modern currency, which financial institutions would handle such transactions without excessive scrutiny, and legal strategies for defending ownership against challenges from family members. Most valuable of all was Morrison's analysis of his family's weaknesses. He had documented their tendency toward bullying and intimidation, their reliance on legal manipulation rather than legitimate argument, and their fundamental lack of patience when faced with sustained resistance. They will expect quick capitulation, Morrison had written. Their entire strategy depends on overwhelming opponents before sustained opposition can be organized. Patient resistance will ultimately defeat them, as they lack the character for prolonged struggle. As Daniel carefully returned the documents to their hiding place, he realized that Morrison had given him more than treasure. He had provided a strategic manual for the battle that was about to unfold. The original Morrison had faced the same choice. Daniel now confronted surrender to powerful interests or fight for what was rightfully his. Morrison's decision to hide his wealth rather than surrender it had created this moment. This test of whether another generation would have the courage to claim what had been earned through intelligence and determination. Monday morning brought Daniel to Eleanor's house with a manila envelope containing photocopies of every document he had discovered. Eleanor's dining room table became a research station as they spread out the evidence of James Morrison's elaborate planning and his family's decades-long search for his hidden wealth. "Look at this," Eleanor said, pointing to a genealogy chart she had been working on since their last meeting. "Rick Morrison isn't just a descendant of James Morrison. He's the great-grandson, and according to family records I found at the Historical Society, he's been designated as the family's primary representative in matters relating to the estate." The family tree revealed a pattern that explained much about Rick Morrison's desperation. James Morrison had left behind 3 children, but only one male heir had survived to continue the family name. That heir had spent his entire life searching for his father's hidden wealth. Passing the obsession down through 2 more generations, Rick Morrison has been preparing for this opportunity his entire adult life, Eleanor continued. His real estate business was specifically designed to give him legal access to properties throughout the region. Every property sale, every development project, every zoning dispute has been part of his systematic search. Eleanor produced a collection of newspaper clippings dating back to the 1960s, documenting Rick Morrison's father's real estate activities. The pattern was unmistakable. Morrison Properties had been involved in dozens of transactions throughout the region, always with unusual interest in properties that had once belonged to the original James Morrison estate. "They've been patient," Daniel observed, studying the timeline Eleanor had created. 3 generations of searching, using legitimate business activities as cover for treasure hunting. "But their patience is running out," Eleanor replied. "Rick Morrison is 57 years old, and he's invested enormous resources in this search. His business records show mounting debts and failed investments. Finding James Morrison's treasure isn't just a family obsession anymore. It's become financial necessity." Eleanor had discovered something else during her research, something that explained the urgency in Rick Morrison's recent behavior. Court records showed that Morrison Properties was facing foreclosure on several major projects, with creditors demanding payment on loans that had been secured against anticipated future discoveries. "He's been borrowing against treasure that he hadn't found yet," Eleanor explained. "If he doesn't locate James Morrison's wealth soon, he'll lose everything his family has built." Over the past century, the documentation revealed that Rick Morrison had convinced investors to fund his real estate ventures by promising access to historically significant artifacts of substantial value. Bank records showed loans totaling millions of dollars, all based on Morrison's claims that he was close to recovering his great-grandfather's legacy. This explains the surveillance and the legal pressure, Daniel realized. Rick Morrison can't afford to let anyone else claim what he's been promising to his creditors, Eleanor nodded grimly. And it explains why the lawyers are being so aggressive. This isn't just about family pride anymore. It's about preventing financial ruin for multiple generations of Morrison descendants. The most disturbing discovery was a private investigator's report that Eleanor had obtained through her contacts at the Historical Society. The report documented Rick Morrison's activities over the past decade, revealing that he had been systematically investigating anyone who showed interest in properties connected to his great-grandfather's estate. Previous property owners have been intimidated, threatened, and in some cases bought out at inflated prices just to prevent them from making discoveries, Eleanor said quietly. "Daniel, you're not the first person to stumble onto James Morrison's secrets, but you might be the first one with the knowledge and determination necessary to actually claim them." The report included photographs of the surveillance equipment Daniel had discovered, along with documentation of similar devices placed on other properties throughout the region. Rick Morrison had been operating what amounted to a private intelligence network, monitoring multiple locations simultaneously in hopes of identifying someone who might lead him to his family's treasure. "There's something else you need to know," Eleanor said, producing a final document. They contacted a lawyer friend in Seattle, and she did some research on Baxter, Morrison and Associates. "They're legitimate, but they're also expensive. Rick Morrison is paying them substantial retainer fees for services that his real estate business can't possibly afford." The financial analysis revealed that Rick Morrison was operating on borrowed time and borrowed money. His creditors were growing impatient, and his legal strategies were consuming resources faster than his business could generate them. "He's desperate," Daniel concluded, "which makes him dangerous, but it also means he's likely to make mistakes." Eleanor agreed. James Morrison understood his family's character when he wrote that will. He knew they would eventually overextend themselves through greed and impatience. That's exactly what's happening now. Tuesday evening found Daniel and Eleanor in her living room, surrounded by documents that told the complete story of James Morrison's operation and his family's century-long quest to recover his hidden wealth. But documentation alone wouldn't be enough to protect Daniel's claim against the legal and financial resources Rick Morrison could bring to bear. "We need to establish an official record of everything you've discovered," Eleanor said, adjusting her reading glasses as she reviewed a legal strategy document they had been developing. Photographs, detailed inventories, expert authentication of the historical artifacts. "We need evidence that would stand up in federal court if necessary." Daniel had spent the day creating a comprehensive photographic record of the underground chambers, the safe's contents and every document he had discovered. Each photograph was dated and included written descriptions that would allow independent verification of his discoveries. Eleanor had contacted Dr. Margaret Foster, a historian at the State University who specialized in Prohibition-era research. Dr. Foster had agreed to provide expert authentication of the documents and artifacts, lending academic credibility to Daniel's claims that would be difficult for Morrison's lawyers to challenge. "The key is timing," Eleanor explained. "We need to establish your legal claim before Rick Morrison can escalate his pressure tactics. Once there's an official record with state and federal authorities, he'll have to work within the legal system rather than relying on intimidation." They had identified several strategies for protecting Daniel's interests. The first was filing a formal application with the State Historical Preservation Office, documenting the underground chambers as a significant archaeological site. This would trigger federal protections that would make it illegal for anyone to disturb the site without proper permits. The second strategy was more aggressive. Eleanor had discovered that James Morrison's original will, the one Daniel had found in the safe, had never been properly probated. According to state law, Daniel could petition the court to recognize the will and establish himself as the rightful beneficiary of Morrison's estate. "It's a legal longshot," Eleanor admitted, "but it would force Rick Morrison to prove his claim in open court with full disclosure of his family's activities over the past century. He might not be willing to risk that kind of scrutiny." Daniel studied the application Eleanor had prepared for the Historical Preservation Office. The document detailed the chamber's construction, their historical significance, and their potential value for understanding Prohibition-era activities in the region. Approval would effectively create a protective legal barrier around the entire site. "What about the bearer bonds?" Daniel asked. "Can Rick Morrison claim those even if we establish historical protection for the site?" Eleanor had researched that question extensively. Bearer bonds belong to whoever possesses them, regardless of how they were originally acquired. If you can prove you discovered them on property you legally own, they're yours under state and federal law. But she had also discovered a complication. Converting $4 million in bearer bonds to modern currency would trigger federal reporting requirements that would alert multiple government agencies to Daniel's discovery. The process would need to be handled carefully to avoid unwanted attention. James Morrison was smarter than we initially realized, Eleanor said, reviewing his financial instructions. He included specific guidance for converting bearer bonds without triggering suspicious activity reports. The process involves working with certain financial institutions that specialize in handling historical securities. Daniel felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He wasn't just protecting his own interests anymore. He was preserving a piece of regional history and ensuring that James Morrison's carefully planned legacy wouldn't fall into the hands of people who would exploit it for personal gain. The phone rang at 9 o'clock, interrupting their planning session. Eleanor answered cautiously, her expression growing concerned as she listened to the caller. "That was Tom Brennan," she said after hanging up. "Rick Morrison was at the gear shop this afternoon, asking questions about your work schedule and whether you had mentioned finding anything interesting on your property." The escalation was beginning. Rick Morrison was no longer content to wait and watch. He was actively gathering intelligence about Daniel's activities and probably planning more direct intervention. "We need to move faster than I hoped," Eleanor said grimly. "If Morrison is conducting active surveillance and questioning your associates, he's preparing for something more aggressive than legal pressure." Daniel felt a surge of determination that surprised him with its intensity. James Morrison had faced similar pressure from powerful interests and had chosen to fight rather than surrender. Now it was Daniel's turn to decide whether he would honor that legacy or allow decades of careful planning to be undone by greed and intimidation. "Tomorrow we file everything," Daniel decided. Historical preservation application, court petition to probate the will, and formal documentation of discovery with the county recorder's office. Let's see how Rick Morrison handles fighting in the open instead of from the shadows. Wednesday morning brought the sound of multiple vehicles climbing the dirt road to Daniel's property. From his position in the hut, he could see 3 black SUVs making their way through the pine trees. Their expensive paint jobs and city license plates announcing that Rick Morrison had decided to abandon subtle pressure in favor of direct confrontation. Daniel had spent the morning completing his preparations. Every document had been photographed and copies stored in multiple locations. Eleanor had filed the historical preservation application at dawn, creating an official record that would be difficult to suppress or ignore. The legal machinery was now in motion, but Morrison apparently intended to resolve the situation before bureaucratic procedures could protect Daniel's interests. Rick Morrison emerged from the lead vehicle wearing a business suit that looked absurdly out of place in the mountain wilderness. Behind him came 2 men in expensive casual wear, who moved with the controlled alertness of professional security personnel. The third vehicle disgorged 3 people in business attire who carried briefcases and surveying equipment. "Daniel," Morrison called out as he approached the hut, his voice carrying forced friendliness that didn't reach his eyes. "I brought some associates who can help us resolve this situation quickly and profitably for everyone involved." The associates included lawyers, a surveyor, and what appeared to be a private security team. Morrison had come prepared for multiple contingencies, suggesting he intended to leave with either a signed sales agreement or physical control of the property. "I'm not interested in selling," Daniel replied calmly, standing in the hut's doorway with his arms crossed. "And I've already filed documentation with state authorities regarding the historical significance of this site." Morrison's facade cracked slightly. "That was premature and unnecessary. My legal team can resolve any historical preservation issues much more efficiently than state bureaucrats." One of the lawyers stepped forward, a thin woman with silver hair who radiated professional intimidation. "Mr. Hayes, you're facing potential federal charges for disturbing protected archaeological sites. We're prepared to help you avoid those complications if you're willing to cooperate." Daniel had expected this strategy. Morrison's team was trying to use fear of legal consequences to pressure him into surrendering his claim. But Eleanor's research had prepared him for exactly these tactics. "I've documented everything properly," Daniel responded. "State archaeologists will be here next week to conduct official assessments. Any attempts to disturb the site before then would constitute federal crimes." The surveyor had been quietly examining the property boundaries, and Morrison gestured for him to begin setting up equipment. "We're going to need detailed measurements for the environmental impact assessment," Morrison explained. Though his true intentions were obvious, Daniel realized that Morrison intended to claim the property was contaminated or historically protected in ways that would allow his team to take control under environmental or archaeological pretenses. The surveying equipment was cover for searching the property more systematically. "You're trespassing," Daniel said firmly. "I haven't given permission for any surveys or assessments." One of the security personnel moved closer, his hand resting casually on what appeared to be a concealed weapon. "Mr. Hayes, we're trying to handle this professionally, but there are legal authorities involved now, and cooperation would be in everyone's best interest." The implied threat was clear. Morrison had brought muscle to back up his legal pressure, and he was prepared to use it if necessary. But Daniel had advantages that Morrison hadn't considered. From his shirt pocket, Daniel pulled out a folded document that Eleanor had prepared during their strategy session. "This is a copy of the court petition I filed this morning, requesting probate of James Robert Morrison's authentic will, the one that specifically disinherits his family and designates discovered assets for whoever legally owns the property where they're found." Morrison's face went pale. "That's impossible. My great-grandfather's will was probated decades ago." "The will that was probated was a forgery," Daniel replied, enjoying Morrison's obvious shock. "The real will is quite different, and it's currently being authenticated by state historians. You might want to consult with your lawyers about the implications of spending 70 years searching for assets that were never legally yours." The lawyers immediately huddled with Morrison, their urgent whispers suggesting they hadn't been prepared for this development. Morrison's entire strategy had been based on the assumption that his family had legitimate claim to James Morrison's wealth. "We're leaving," Morrison announced suddenly, his composure shattered. "But this isn't over. You're in possession of assets that rightfully belong to the Morrison family, and we will pursue every legal avenue to recover them." As the convoy of vehicles retreated down the mountain road, Daniel felt a mixture of victory and apprehension. He had won this confrontation, but Morrison would undoubtedly regroup and return with new strategies. The battle for James Morrison's legacy was just beginning. Thursday afternoon brought Eleanor racing up the mountain road in her old sedan, her face flushed with excitement and a manila envelope clutched in her hands. She had spent the morning at the state archives, following a lead that had emerged from Dr. Foster's authentication work. And what she had discovered would change everything. "Daniel, you need to see this," she called out as she hurried toward the hut. "Dr. Foster found something in the state records that Rick Morrison's lawyers definitely don't want anyone to know about." Eleanor spread the contents of the envelope across the hut's table, revealing documents that bore official state seals and authentication stamps. At the center was a legal document that made Daniel's breath catch, the original last will and testament of James Robert Morrison, filed with the State Attorney General's office in 1929 as part of a federal investigation. James Morrison knew he was under federal surveillance, Eleanor explained, her voice tight with excitement. Before he disappeared, he filed copies of his real will with state and federal authorities as protection against exactly what his family has been doing for the past century. The official will was identical to the one Daniel had found in the safe, but this copy bore witness signatures and notarization that would be impossible to challenge in court. More importantly, it included a detailed affidavit from Morrison himself, explaining his reasons for disinheriting his family and establishing specific criteria for who could legitimately claim his hidden assets. "Listen to this," Eleanor said, reading from Morrison's affidavit. I have concluded that my descendants lack the moral character necessary to manage wealth responsibly. They have demonstrated greed, dishonesty, and willingness to harm others for personal gain. Therefore, I direct that my concealed assets shall belong to whoever discovers them through legitimate ownership of the properties where they are hidden. But the most damaging revelation was Morrison's detailed description of his family's character and activities. He had documented their attempts to pressure him into revealing the location of his wealth, their threats against business associates, and their willingness to use violence to achieve their goals. Rick Morrison's great-grandfather was apparently just as ruthless as his descendant, Eleanor continued. James Morrison's affidavit describes threats, intimidation, and at least one incident of physical violence. The family pattern goes back generations. Dr. Foster had also discovered something else in the federal archives, evidence that the Morrison family had been under FBI surveillance for decades, suspected of using illegal methods in their search for James Morrison's treasure. The surveillance had documented bribes, threats, and possible connections to organized crime figures who specialized in recovering hidden assets. They've been committing crimes for 70 years, Daniel realized. All of their real estate dealings, all of their pressure tactics, all of their attempts to acquire properties throughout the region have been part of an illegal conspiracy to steal assets that were never legally theirs. Eleanor nodded grimly. And there's more. Dr. Foster contacted colleagues at other universities, and similar patterns have been documented in 3 other states. The Morrison family has been operating a multi-generational criminal enterprise, using legitimate business activities as cover for systematic treasure hunting. The implications were staggering. Rick Morrison wasn't just a desperate descendant trying to claim his inheritance. He was part of an ongoing criminal conspiracy that had been operating for nearly a century, using threats and intimidation to steal assets from legitimate property owners. This explains why they've been so aggressive, Daniel said. They can't afford to have their activities exposed to federal scrutiny. If authorities start investigating their search for James Morrison's treasure, they'll uncover decades of criminal activity. Eleanor produced one final document that sealed Rick Morrison's fate. A copy of James Morrison's original disappearance report, filed with federal authorities in 1930, included specific allegations against his family members. Morrison had accused them of planning to kill him if he didn't reveal the location of his hidden wealth. James Morrison didn't disappear voluntarily, Eleanor said quietly. He went into hiding because he believed his own family was planning to murder him. The federal agents investigating his case concluded that his fears were well-founded. As Daniel absorbed the significance of Eleanor's discoveries, he realized that Rick Morrison's desperate attempts to claim the treasure had exposed his family to exactly the kind of federal investigation they had been avoiding for decades. By pressuring Daniel so aggressively, Morrison had created a paper trail that documented ongoing criminal activity. We need to contact federal authorities immediately, Daniel decided. This isn't just about property ownership anymore. This is about stopping a criminal organization that has been terrorizing innocent people for 3 generations. Eleanor agreed. James Morrison left us more than treasure. He left us the evidence necessary to finally bring his family's crimes to justice. Friday morning brought federal agents to Cedar Falls, their unmarked vehicles and serious demeanor creating a stir throughout the small town that had been gossiping about Daniel's foolish property purchase for weeks. Special Agent Sarah Mitchell of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division had driven up from Seattle with a team of investigators after Eleanor's call had triggered a review of files that had been gathering dust for decades. Daniel met the agents at the hut, where Agent Mitchell examined the underground chambers with the methodical attention of someone who understood both historical significance and criminal evidence. Her team photographed everything, documented the sophisticated construction, and carefully catalogued the contents of James Morrison's safe. This is remarkable preservation, Agent Mitchell observed as she studied the bearer bonds and financial documents. We've been tracking the Morrison family's activities for years, but we never had evidence this comprehensive. Your discovery provides documentation of financial crimes that we suspected but couldn't prove. The federal investigation moved quickly. Within hours, agents had obtained warrants for Rick Morrison's business records, personal files, and financial accounts. The surveillance equipment Daniel had discovered on his property provided evidence of illegal monitoring, while Morrison's threatening behavior constituted criminal intimidation. The Morrison family has been operating what amounts to a criminal enterprise for 3 generations. Agent Mitchell explained to Daniel and Eleanor as they reviewed the evidence. They've used legitimate business activities as cover for systematic extortion, illegal surveillance, and intimidation of property owners throughout the region. By afternoon, Rick Morrison was in federal custody, along with 2 of his associates who had been involved in the surveillance and intimidation activities. The lawyers from Baxter, Morrison and Associates were cooperating with authorities, providing evidence about the family's illegal activities in exchange for reduced charges. The news spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. Martha's Diner buzzed with conversations about federal agents, hidden treasure, and the dramatic reversal of fortune that had transformed Daniel from the town fool into a local hero. Tom Brennan closed the outdoor gear shop early to join the crowd of curious townspeople who gathered to witness the unprecedented excitement. "Never seen anything like it," Tom said, shaking his head as he watched federal agents loading evidence into their vehicles. "That boy bought himself a piece of history and ended up uncovering the biggest criminal investigation this region has ever seen." Dr. Foster arrived from the university with a team of graduate students and professional archaeologists, beginning the process of properly documenting and preserving the underground chambers. The site would eventually become a museum and research facility, providing visitors with insights into Prohibition-era history and the sophisticated networks that had operated throughout the mountain regions. This discovery will rewrite our understanding of organized crime during Prohibition, Dr. Foster explained to the gathering crowd. James Morrison's operation was far more sophisticated than anything we've documented in academic literature. These chambers and their contents represent one of the most significant historical finds of the past century. Eleanor stood beside Daniel, watching the controlled chaos of federal investigation and historical documentation with satisfaction. Her grandfather's suspicions had finally been vindicated, and the Morrison family's criminal legacy was being exposed to the public scrutiny it had avoided for decades. "Your grandfather would be proud," Daniel told her quietly. "He knew something wasn't right about that family, and his careful record-keeping made this investigation possible." Eleanor smiled, her eyes bright with tears of vindication and relief. "He always said the truth has a way of surfacing eventually. It just took longer than he expected." As evening approached and the federal agents completed their initial investigation, Agent Mitchell approached Daniel with news about the financial aspects of his discovery. The bearer bonds were indeed valid and could be converted to modern currency through established procedures that would comply with all federal regulations. "You're looking at approximately $4 million in 1929 currency," she explained. "Adjusted for inflation and current market values, that translates to roughly $45 million in today's purchasing power." The number was staggering, far beyond anything Daniel had imagined when he first pried up that loose floorboard. But more important than the wealth was the knowledge that James Morrison's carefully planned legacy had finally reached someone who would honor his intentions. "There will be paperwork," Agent Mitchell continued. "Federal procedures for handling historical securities, tax implications, and legal documentation to establish clear ownership. But the law is clear. You discovered these assets on property you legitimately own. following clues left by someone who specifically intended them for whoever had the intelligence and courage to claim them.